Fáilte go dtí, córa sa gúrán.
Fáilte go choráin an sa choile.
Welcome to Conversations in the Grove, a show about Druidry in ancient and modern times. So in season 1, we will be discussing the relationship and the correlation between animism and Druidry. In our first episode, we defined animism. We also discussed the similarities between animism, Druidry, and polytheism. Now, if you haven't had the opportunity to view episode 1, you can watch the full episode. That's almost 2 hours of content for free by going to Dunmore Druid Order's public group Facebook page or Dunmore Druid Order's YouTube channel. Now, please remember to like and subscribe. If you'd like to support our efforts, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to patreon.com/conversationsinthegrove. Thank you. So moving more deeply into the topics of Druidry and animism, for today's show, we'll be discussing Druids as healers and the connectivity between their use of plants and the significance of plants and animistic practices. So although much of Druidry and its customs, rituals, and practices are veiled in mystery, we can glean some information about Druids as healers from mythology. In Irish tradition, we find the myth of Achaidh, who is a physician to the Tuatha De Danann, and he is also known as the chief healing deity to the Irish. So his son Miach, an Irish god associated with surgery, and his daughter Armid, an Irish goddess associated with herbal healing, both of whom have possessed their father, Achaidh's healing talents. So I'm going to turn things over to you, Ben. As a practicing Druid, how do you think this myth illustrates acquired healing skills and a knowledge of the Druid caste?
Well, one of the things I find most interesting about that story is that there seems to be a common Indo-European theme that that a healing god does violence, and that there's a violent aspect to healing in that ancient tradition. And it's not something that I fully understand myself, because it's not really, a field that I work in on my own. But one of the interesting things is that when Achaidh kills Miach, there's a loss of knowledge that takes place. And so the healer is inflicting a wound on the tradition at the same time when he kills his son. And it's done out of jealousy because he's able to perform a feat of healing that Achaidh cannot. So Achaidh is able to attach the a silver arm that Govining Gao is able to fashion and then join to the arm of Nuada. But Miach then is able to go later, and he actually digs up the severed arm of Nua and reattaches, and then brings it back to life, and is able to reattach it to his body. And because of that, Achaidh kills Miach, and the other parts of that story take off from there. But the other thing that the three of them are able to do, and only the three of them are able to do, is that they're able to dig the well of healing that the Tuatha De Danann used during their battle with the Fáilrí. So when Achaidh kills his son, they're no longer able to create that well of healing. That knowledge is lost because it takes the three of them to do it. So Ermit, after she grieves over Miach's grave, these plants come up, and she's able to sort them according to their properties. But then again, Achaidh comes along and mixes them up. So there's a loss of knowledge that seems inherent in the tradition, that, and then, you know, either there was at one point a time in the tradition where all of these properties were known, and they were lost, or Ermut is, and Brendan can probably speak on this more since he's a lot more, you know, knowledgeable about herbalism than I certainly am. That Ermut is sort of a go-between between the Druid and the spirits of plants, and instructs a healer or an herbalist or a Druid on what plants to use, when, and how. And I'm sure, just like most indigenous traditions, there are songs associated with each plant that bring out the spirit of that plant, that honor the spirit of that plant. And so, you know, we're seeing, from my point of view, these echoes of a tradition that was probably very, very old, you know, pre-Druidic, and were folded into the tradition because, you know, healing is such an important part of any culture.
Yeah, I'm thinking, Ben, of several things in relation to the narrative and to what you were just saying. One is there's a story of in Egypt of a temple magician who's also a famous healer, whose name I can't remember right now. It's not a famous historical character or anything. It's a rather obscure figure. But apparently he observed as a healer in Egypt that all of this traditional plant lore, and I think this was during the Alexandrian period, in the Hellenistic period in Egypt, that all this pre-Hellenistic plant lore had been lost, and that they had these texts that the healers had that only gave like partial understanding of how to access the spirits of plants and what they were each to be utilized for in healing, etc. And found that there was a muddling of the tradition. And so actually went to a temple to call on, God, was it Asclepius? To call on the god of healing. And I can't remember off the top of my head if it was an Egyptian deity or if it was a Hellenistic syncretic deity. But at any rate, called on this deity, and the deity appeared in the temple and said, oh yes, you're missing all this information that was lost from the tradition. Here are the connecting points. And then this healer supposedly left Egypt and went into the classical world and became a renowned healer, you know, who had people lined up around the block all the time because what he was doing actually worked, because he went and consulted the deity who had maintained that knowledge. So I think there's something, like you were saying, Ben, there's something similar here that's probably a really buried tradition in Druidry that relates to the knowledge of how to be a healer and the transmission of that knowledge and the understanding of how these plants are traditionally employed. And that, you know, that's something we can sort of excavate from the surviving texts, and we can think about it in correspondence to other living indigenous traditions of plant-based healing. But indeed, the core of it has been lost, right? I mean, that's sort of and in a way that's maybe the medieval scribes, in choosing how they recorded this particular narrative, maybe they're kind of cryptically transmitting that understanding that this is lost now. Because the idea is that only what Jean Kecht says is that Achaidh will live, even though Miach had to die. Achaidh will live, but only she will carry the knowledge of how these plants work together and how they each individually work in the art of healing. So anyone who wishes to have that knowledge must go through her, must have recourse to her presence. And then you think about Christianization and that line being broken, you know. So that's an interesting thing to reflect on. I was also thinking about, I don't know why I'm finding all these Hellenistic parallels today, but I was also thinking about the story of Polyeidos, the great healer sage who is a myth. The myth of Polyeidos is a Hellenistic story about a sage and healer who figures out how to resurrect people from the dead by consulting with a serpent who comes from under the earth and gives the secrets of these particular healing plants, or 3 leaves of one plant in specific, and we don't know what the plant was. It's not named in the story. But he then takes on an apprentice, and that apprentice, you know, learns all of the ways of magic and miraculous healing and all the ancient traditions that Polyeidos carried. But then when Polyeidos' term in this land is up, and because he's been indentured to and sort of forced to apprentice this young man who is the king's son. And then at the end of that stint, when he says, I've finally passed on all that I know, as he's getting ready to get on the ship, he has Glaukos is the young man's name. He has Glaukos spit into his mouth before he gets on the ship to depart. And, you know, everybody thinks, well, this is bizarre, but Glaukos, being a good, humble student, apprentice, does what his master requests, spits into Polyeidos' mouth. And Polyeidos says farewell to everyone, farewell, my faithful disciple, etc., gets on the ship and sails away. And as soon as he's sailed away, Glaukos realizes he took back all the knowledge that he'd given me. I have no memory now of anything that was learned. So there's this kind of like jealous guarding in the Indo-European milieu of the secrets of the healing traditions, and there's something there too about them going back to a transmission from the underworld, or from the heart of the earth herself, and the serpent as the transmitter or the carrier of that deep esoteric knowledge that the healers hold. So I don't know, it's interesting to think about. I also thought about one last thing, which is also Hellenistic. I thought about pharmakon, the concept of pharmakon, that in regards to the killing and what you mentioned, Ben, about the violence that the healer does, the idea of Plato's, Plato uses the term pharmakon, and it means both simultaneously the poison and the cure. And that's really instructive, I think, that there's this deep tradition in Western herbalism related to signatures and related to what eventually, much later on down the line, became homeopathy, this idea that the poison is the cure if properly understood and properly administered. And so there's some deep essence there as well, I think, with regard to this narrative of Druidcraft and Miach and Achaidh, that the violence, the poison, in some way is the same force, the same power or principle that cures. And what we make of that and how we integrate it is another question. But
yeah, it's interesting that I remember there's this really good show on the Irish radio, or the Irish television station, TG Cahir, called On Gary Glass, and it's done by a woman. It's hosted by a woman named Sheila McConaughey, and there was this one episode that's really good. She goes to, I believe she's in, I can't remember where she is in Ireland. I think she's in Connemara, but she goes to a family that is sort of renowned for working with comfrey, and they and I think it's actually more than one. I can't, it's escaping me, but one of the interesting things was that there was a particular song that they would sing to the comfrey, that when they used it for bone setting, and it was interesting. He kind of walked Sheila through the whole process. So they would plant comfrey on a hillside that was in, I think it was in their, I think it might have been in their backyard, or it was somewhere on their own land. But they planted it on the hillside because that way you could get access to the root without having to dig the plant all the way up. So you could just dig into the side of the hill, break off a piece of the root, and then rebury it. And the plant was still, the plant was basically unharmed. And then they would sing, it was a song that had been passed on to him by his grandfather, which he wouldn't sing. It was like, no, we don't, this is, proprietary family knowledge here. And the song was sung after they would dress, so they would he would take scrapings of the root, and they would, he'd kind of just like, he took a knife and he would just scrape the side of the root off until it was kind of all shredded up. And then they would place that over a broken bone, then wrap the broken bone or the arm in the leaves of the comfrey root, and then they would wrap the leaves and the roots up in a bandage, and it had great success setting a bone and letting it heal. What's so interesting about that is, again, there's that secrecy that comes into it. And I find it interesting that one family kind of works with this particular plant specifically for broken bones. So if you live in that village, or you live in that area, then you go to that family because they happen to have that particular knowledge about broken bones and how to use comfrey to do it. But more importantly, they have the song that no one else has. So, and it's not, it's not something that you easily remember, at least from what I remember him telling Sheila, was that it's not something you easily remember because you don't, how often do you break a bone? Some people never break a bone. Or if you do break a bone, it may happen once or twice or 3 times in your life. It's not like it's, that common of a thing to happen. So that secrecy part is still obviously there. And when it's connected to a family like that, you have to wonder how common that may have been in previous times, where, just a particular family knew how to work with a particular plant that was local to their area, or grew, abundantly wherever they happened to live. And so they learned to work with that plant, and they learned the many uses of it. And that comes down, I think, at the root of that tradition is, going way back to an animistic connection with that plant. The plant has if you're singing a song to that plant that is unlocking its powers, then you're singing to a living being that can understand your song and responds to that song. And so the animistic part of that is just very obvious when you bring in the song aspect of it, to sing to the plant so that it, responds to, the need at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that motif is perennial. I mean, as you alluded to, Ben, pretty much every indigenous culture has a tradition that taps into that vein of animistic experience, that the healer can access in real terms the soul of, or the totem spirit, if you will, of that plant species, and learn its song. And having the song is a key to unlocking the healing powers of that particular plant. It makes me think too of, in staying in Celtic traditions, the stuff that was recorded in Carmina, in Scotland. And there are certain songs for, it's a little bit different, but I think it's in a similar vein, certain songs for harvesting the St. John's wort, and this idea that there are runes or sacred songs that go with things in the natural world. And to sing that song is in some way to resonate with the fabric, the spiritual fabric of that entity, of that being, whether it's the sun or a certain plant or a certain sacred well or a part of the landscape. So in some way, singing the song not only honors that being, but also creates a resonance between the singer and the recipient, or the being whose soul is encoded in that song, right? So there's a really beautiful process of interconnection there that I think is, again, perennial, but also certainly expressed in the Gaelic traditions at very least. I think we could probably also dig up some interesting references in the Brythonic milieu, but I'd have to think more about that.
Yeah, it's a branch of the tradition that I'm not as, certainly not as, schooled in as the Irish and the Scottish.
Mhm.
Yeah, but like, some of the songs, some of the songs for harvesting a plant, right? Like you do see that in the Carmina Gadelica, like with Yarrow and some of the others. And I know, I think there's also something really powerful about singing a song that connects you to a living, to the living spirit of a plant. And not only that, and you're also connecting with everybody who sung that song before you. So whoever taught you that song, whoever taught them that song. And so you're, not only are you awakening the spirit of that plant, but you're also connecting to the people who taught you the properties of that plant and the powers of that plant. And so you're bringing in the power of your own spirit, you're bringing in the power of the plant spirit, you're also bringing in the power of all your ancestors in that moment, because there seems, at least to me, one of the most beautiful things about Druidry or any indigenous view of time is that you're connecting back to the first song, but the first time that song was sung to the plant. And that when that connection, that gap between human and plant was initially made, and you're pulling in the magic of that moment. And that's a timeless moment. You're moving into a place that isn't bounded by time and space. It's somehow, it's in that, by singing the song, you are in a threshold moment, and you're between the worlds, and the ability to pull the brie or that healing power out of the plant and out of yourself into the person who's in need is just easier.
Yeah. Yeah, it also echoes this kind of larger concept in the Druidic tradition, broadly speaking, of the first ones, which is a phrase I find myself using often to talk about the tradition, because there's this idea that's, I think, innate to the myths and to the origin texts of place, you know, Den Sheneches, and that transmission. There's this principle of, by invoking or understanding or embodying the first one, the origin point, then we're connecting to that lineage and bringing forward something that is far, far greater than us. So in a way, if we think about this notion of the god of Druids that comes up in Irish poetic text, to me that implies a Druidic ancestor, a first one, maybe a proto-Druidic figure, who we, in a sense, become when we connect and stand in that lineage. And we draw from that origin point, and that's what gives us our power or authority or whatever, to the extent we have those things, right? But there's that meaningful sense of ancestry and origins. And I think Achaidh, to circle back to this little mythic interlude, that Achaidh is that for the healer, and we don't really know within the sacral class of Gaelic societies, you know, who were the healers. Were they Druids per se? Were they Fili? We don't know for sure. My suspicion is that probably most of them were Fili, because Bridget is also connected with healing, and she's the patroness of poets. So I've always kind of made that connection as well, that probably the poet seers were the healers more than the Druid priests, who were the brehons and, you know, function in a different sacramental and liturgical role, and in a legal role, etc. But at any rate, that being left aside, Achaidh seems to be the first one in terms of the origin points of the understanding of the knowledge of healing plants, and how to curate that knowledge, and how to administer it, and how to draw from it and resonate with it. So I think maybe that's the essence of that little tale, is pointing back to that origin point.
Well, I'm going to jump in here with doing research. One of the things I came across in this book of mine that's many, many years old, but Alexei Kondratiev, I hope I'm saying his name correctly, but The Apple Branch, A Path to Celtic Ritual. And in there, he kind of breaks down and discusses the myth about Gian Cecht. And one of the things that he speculates on, I'd like to ask the two of you about, and I'll just kind of paraphrase what he said here. So he from this myth, I think we can gather that there is what one might refer to as a system of classification for herbs. Now, I believe this is probably coming more from a Celtic perspective than specifically a Druid perspective. But it seems that each of these three functions relate to specific herbs. So, for example, he has the herbs of the first function, like henbane or vervain, which may have been highly valued by the Druids. And there are herbs with psychotropic in nature, and other herbs that had spiritual effects that were, again, as we believe, highly valued by the Druids. Now, these herbs were ones that induced a general good feeling, and they were thought to protect one from harmful otherworld entities. The second function he mentions were herbs with coagulant properties, such as St. John's wort and yarrow. And then the final and third function were the herbs that would be used to help heal diseases of the organs, such as male fern, mugwort, house leek, and cinquefoil. So Brendan, I'm going to begin this kind of pitching it over to you. As a certified clinical Western herbalist, do you believe that there's some truth to these herbal applications and classification systems? And then following up with that to both you and Ben, maybe we want to have a conversation that focuses specifically on some of the herbs. And really quickly, what my research has shown, or what my research has found, is that there's a couple of herbs that seem to appear consistently to be affiliated with the Druids. And then the ones that I just mentioned appear to be more of the Celtic herbs of healing. I think there's probably room for a cross section of them, but I'd love to hear the two of you speak on what your perspective is with Druidry, with animism for these specific herbs. So what I've discovered for Druidry obviously is mistletoe, vervain, oak or some other trees, club moss, and then brookweed or brook lime, I think it's been called. So I'm going to turn it over to the two of you and kind of just let you guys have a more spirited and a more lengthy conversation about the system that was identified in the book, The Path to Celtic Ritual, or the Apple Branch, and then just to touch on the idea of herbs that are used for healing, whether they be those herbs that are from a kind of Celtic healing herbal perspective, those from animism, and those from Druidry, and how in the big picture they might all tie in together.
Well, without having Kondratyev's text on hand and looking at that, I'm not sure. I read that book long ago, and I don't remember any specifics about his classification of plants. I will say that it would have veracity to the extent that he's classifying those plants based on their actions in the human body. And in traditional Western herbalism, which is kind of an umbrella, and I won't go into all the nuances of that right now, but basically in traditional Western herbalism, we often talk in terms of temperatures and degrees of temperatures as a way to classify actions of plants in the body. And those, we can then take those temperatures and we can pair them with types of constitution, etc., and use that as a system in which to classify certain plants. Like generally, this plant is a warming plant that induces this constitutional effect, etc. So that's done for sure. And I would imagine that the healers, whether Druids or Fili or whatever they were, in ancient Celtic societies had a similar system of classification, but that information has been lost to us. So that would be a reconstructive effort that would be probably mostly made of speculation, to be honest. But of course, we can always have discourse with other traditions and pull from the Western tradition more generally in a broad sense. I've personally come upon a system that I've used in my own herbalism practice as a Western herbalist that does draw from ancestral Celtic traditions, one Gaelic and one Brythonic actually. So it's sort of twofold. One is in relationship to the three primary energy centers in the human person, the three cauldrons from Irish tradition. And the other valence is the sevenfold elements of the person. What Taliesin comes from a poem by Taliesin in the Welsh tradition. He talks about the 7 elements of the human person that make up the human person. So as far as I know, that's novel to me. I don't think anyone has taken that Taliesin framework, or that I know of the 3 cauldron framework, and incorporated them into herbalism and thought about how to categorize plants and actions of plants with relationship to those 2 things. So I think we can do that kind of reconstructive work by looking at the tradition and comparing it intelligently with other extant or living traditions. And so yeah, I would say that to the extent that Kondratiev is looking at that broad approach to classification based on constitutions and actions and whatnot, then there might be some merit to it. But again, I can't speak to it directly without seeing it again. So.
Well, and also I think we have to be, we have the burden and we have the privilege of creating something new out of the context of the old.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, when you take what you were describing, Brendan, about your approach, it may not have been used, or it may have, who knows, it may not have been used in older times ancestrally. But the fact is that we're looking at the skeleton of the tradition, and we're putting flesh and bone and blood, and, you know, we're joining sinew to sinew, bone to bone, you know, vein to vein, muscle to muscle, flesh to flesh. And that is the whole point. And I think what's so beautiful about that is that we may contextualize it in a different way than they may have previously. But that's really the essence of what a living tradition is. And when we're, I don't know, I guess when we use the bones of the tradition, we still have the integrity of the tradition. We still have the underlying strength of it. But we're giving something new back to the tradition. We're introducing something that is just as powerful and just as helpful and just as worthy of being remembered and passed on than the things we may read or hear about. And for me, you know, I don't have the benefit of having an herbalism education. So for me, you know, when I first started kind of learning about plants and what they do, I was so overwhelmed by the amount of information that's out there that I decided earlier on, like, you know what, I'm just going to work with what's around me. Like I live next to an open space, and I decided I'm just going to get to know the plants in this particular park, in this open space. And I'm not going to worry about anything else besides those plants because they're right there. I know when they flower and what they look like when they sprout and what they look like in the winter after they've died. And, you know, just getting to know the plants that are very close by to me was helpful, just because it helped me kind of filter out, you know, because when you get a book, you know, even if it's a book on the Rocky Mountains, there's a lot of plants in that book, and it's hard to kind of be like, what, you know, wow, how can I possibly remember all of this? And some people may be able to do that, but for me, it's, you know, I need to have my hands on the plant. I need to be able to see it and smell it and kind of look at where it grows and that sort of thing. And that's the only way that it ends up getting kind of implanted into my consciousness, I guess, so I can remember it later on.
Yeah. Well, I think that harkens back to a core animistic principle too, Ben, that we discussed last time, which is relationship and reciprocity. That there's an direct, intimate connection that's really requisite for fully understanding the gifts of a certain soul that's expressed in the natural landscape. And often when I rarely teach herbalism, and that's a very deliberate decision on my part. It's just I'm called to practice it, but not to teach it at least at this stage of my life. But when I do teach a little bit to someone, what I always do first is go out with them onto the landscape and teach them to listen, to see what plant wants to choose them. Not to think in terms of, oh, there's this disease that I want to address, so I need to find the plant that's good for X, right? That's the normal way that we think, which is actually a commodified way of thinking, and really a product of our sort of exploitative capitalistic approach to the world. But if we instead go out and trust that there's a spirit that has healing gifts for us, that's expressed somewhere where we are, and that we will get, nature will provide us with what we need if we're open and listening. And then we walk with that openness of heart and that inquisitiveness, then as long as we understand the way of listening, then we'll be chosen by a spirit when that time is right for us, according to the wisdom of that spirit, not according to our own ideas, right, about when the time is and all that. And that's where the real healing power comes from. That's where a healer, like the story you were mentioning, Ben, about the Irish family, that's where the healing power comes from. It's from relationship with the plant spirit, knowing the songs, and having an ongoing dialogue with that spirit and being in communion with it. That's where the real healing potency comes from. If we take things and strip them out of their context without permission, without relationship, and commodify them and mass produce them in a laboratory and that kind of stuff, it's not to say, of course, that those things won't have any effect at all. It's just a completely different set of effects that will come from that. And it's really more related to, in my view, as a holistic practitioner, that approach is more related to the attacking or suppressing of symptoms rather than the understanding and healing in a holistic way of the root cause of something, right? So they're just two completely different approaches. And so I think starting where we are with what's around us on the landscape is exactly the right starting place, no matter what.
Yeah, I really agree that commodification is that's so right on, because we have this, this is something I've been thinking a lot about recently, is that when you move from one way of life to another, when a culture goes through a major transition, whether that's going from paganism to Christianity, or indigenous Celtic rule to Roman rule, or Christianity to industrialization, we always take things with us from the previous tradition. You can't help it. It's like when we talk about cars, we say horsepower, because that was the only way we could contextualize that, because we have to put it on, we have to think about it in the way that we have thought about it. So we overlay one symbol with another. And we've done the same thing with, and it's understandable. It's just, we have layers over our perception and our thoughts that don't allow us to connect in the same way that maybe our ancestors did. And when you talk about commodification, I think that's one of the most important things, because it's not only do we do that with plants, we do that with animal totems as well. Like, oh, well, this is my animal spirit. This is my, my animal is owl, or my animal is, mouse, or, tiger, or lion, or whatever it happens to be. And I've never felt comfortable with that approach, in the sense that it's, if I was to meet a new person and make friends with them, yes, I will call them my friend, but that's only the end result of a relationship that's taken time to create. And that person has to agree to be in that relationship with me too. I can't just come in grab some random Joe off the street and say, you are now my best friend. You are now going to share with me all your intimate thoughts, and you're going to support me when I need you to support me. And we need that, that ability to listen, like you talked about, is so important, because I remember one of the herbalists I knew in Durango, she was like, well, yes, you can get supplements off the shelves, and you can buy herbs over the internet, and they're going to help. It's not like they don't have their properties, but
yeah,
the plants that you use that are local, that you gather yourself, that you honor yourself, that you give back to when you pick them, they're going to be 1,000 times stronger than anything you're going to get, through the internet. And it's because of that relationship that power is there. Yeah. And that is an animistic perspective, because there's no physical, scientific, corollary there. It's something else. It's something that's ineffable. It's not something that you can really concretize or define, but the relationship is the missing element when we do commodify things, like you said.
Yeah. So I think that there are some really interesting things in a general sense, not necessarily in terms of specifics, ritual specifics, but in a general sense, or in terms of principles. There are some interesting things transmitted by that account from Pliny about the Druids ascending, the oak at midsummer, or in the new moon at midsummer. Is that right, Ben?
The sixth day of the moon, I think.
Sixth day of the moon,
the sixth day,
right.
which corresponds to the half moon, which I find interesting. There's some calendrical associations with that, for sure. Yeah,
we should talk about that too. But but the idea that there are plant spirits that the community or the sacral class, or whatever the case might be, has special relationships with, and that those plant spirits are to be treated with highest honor, I think actually is not even telling us so much about mistletoe specifically, but telling us about the way that the tradition relates to plant spirits. That there's a way in which these things are approached, as we've been discussing, where it's about relationship, it's about reciprocity. A sacrifice is made in order to draw some gift from that particular spirit that it has to offer. And that, I think those principles are really important actually for Druid tradition. Whatever we think about the specifics of Pliny's account, the golden sickle sort of infamously is goofy and whatnot. But those to me almost seem like incidentals. Like what's really transmitted to us through that account are the principles or the principles that are underlying that episode.
Yeah, the idea that there's the right time, to cut or harvest a plant, the giving back, when it's taken, a particular implement that's used that is, more efficacious than say something else.
Yeah.
And I've always felt in my own practice, when I cut say juniper, when I use juniper during a ceremony, I have felt that when I cut it with a ceramic knife versus an iron knife or a steel knife, there does seem to be like it has a little bit more oomph in it, like it has a little bit more power in it that is available to me, in the ceremony. It seems like it's more effective. And, the reason I have done that is just, the whole idea that iron is, repels the Cheide.
Mm-hmm.
And it does seem to me, in my own personal experience, that does make a difference. There is something that is lost when it's cut with iron versus when I cut it like with a ceramic plate. I just prefer that.
Yeah.
And then the timing also with that, like with the golden sickle, one of the explanations that I think is kind of interesting about that symbol is, and I can't remember who I first read this. It was another Druid that suggested this to me, but that the golden sickle is the perfect symbol for a lunisolar calendar, because it is the crescent of the moon in gold. So it's so that it's a symbolic combination of the sun and the moon. And and then the calendrical significance of it, I have to remember the details. There's a guy I'd really like to have on the show at some point that we can interview, but he does the Druidcraft Calendar, and there's some possible associations with the half moon being a way in which you can, when the solar and the lunar calendar gradually go out of sync over time, that the half moon is actually a really good time to sync those two cycles up when they go out of whack. And it takes years and years and years for this to happen, depending on the calendrical system you're using. But and if the mistletoe cut at that moment, to get beyond all the calendrical stuff, which it's a whole nother episode, is that threshold moment we were talking about earlier, where the plant just has more power. It has more, the all heal aspect of mistletoe is brought out in that moment in ways that they may have observed over who knows how many millennia, that when it's cut at this point, in this way, at this time, with these offerings, there's something special about what it imparts that you can't access at other moments.
Right. Well, related to the iron thing, it makes me think also of in the Greco-Egyptian and later resultant European traditions of ceremonial magic. This comes up because it's understood that spirits are averse to iron. Any spirit that you invoke in a theurgic process or what have you can be repelled by tracing a circle using an iron implement, and you actually carry the sword, you carry that implement so that the spirit doesn't intrude. So there's the same principle is at work, that it's a repellent to incorporeal entities for whatever reason.
Yeah, and I remember reading a folk story about a Scottish healer, an older woman, and she said one of the gesh that she had was that on her property she could never cut anything with iron, and if she did, that it would break her her covenant with the spirits
Wow.
in the area. So she was absolutely forbidden to do that. So she had this totally overgrown, mess of a property, I'm sure, as far as her neighbors were concerned. I know a little bit about that. It's sort of the same thing here. But it's interesting that connection with iron being a severing power of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And what's also interesting too, I remember I was watching, and I always wondered about this, I was watching a thing on supernovas, And the beginning of a supernova event is when the star creates iron. As soon as it starts to create iron, it's on its way to becoming a supernova. The elements inside of the star are so heavy that as it creates more and more iron in the core, that's what causes it to collapse and create that explosion. So there seems to be something physically and spiritually powerful about iron that creates an ending of some kind. It creates a stop in a process. And I don't know. I mean, I wonder how that carries into, I mean, have you noticed anything like that with your herbalism when you harvest?
Well, I've noticed it actually more with regard to magical practice than with regard to healing practice. And that's something that I've not reflected on this a great deal, but this would be worth reflecting on and talking about further at some point. Because I have regular steel harvesting knives and stuff that I use when I gather herbs for medicine making. And of course, when I'm harvesting, when I'm wildcrafting, I'm making gifts. I'm asking the plant spirits to give their properties to heal all who come to me as clients, etc. So there's a whole ceremonial process there, but I am using steel blades to do that harvesting. But when I'm harvesting something specific for a magical intention, to be used in that kind of a working, then I'll do the traditional non-iron based implement to harvest. And so I have found that in that setting, there is some subtle difference that I notice. But I don't know, because I've not applied that same principle to my herbalism practice. It would be something I would need to experiment with. I mean, I've harvested with no cutting implements, just sort of using my fingernails or carefully breaking things.
Oh, right.
Stuff like that for medicine making. But I've not utilized like an obsidian blade or something like that for wildcrafting for medicine making. So I don't know, I'd need to experiment with that and see if there's a noticeable difference.
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing that I have, there are really only 3 plants that I use on a regular basis that grow nearby. So I use, I've gathered broadleaf cottonwood buds when they fall in the spring and on the autumn. So I don't have to cut those. They just, since they're what are referred to as I forget the term, self-trimming trees or something. There are certain types of trees that will self-trim it because it's just in the wind, because it's such a soft wood. So they'll fall down, and I'll gather the cottonwood buds. There's I believe, I forget the name of it. You might know it. I think it's called pineapple weed. It's like, it's like a little yellow flower.
Yep.
And they're real sticky, and they have that sort of milky, like, that will come out. I'll gather those flowers in the fall when they, right after they start to close, right after the petals will fall off and they start to close up, and they get real sticky and milky. I'll gather those too. And then, and then I like to gather yucca flowers in the spring, just to pickle and eat, and I'll put them on salads or something like that.
Yeah.
But there's something about that. I also think there's something about consuming those plants that just creates a deeper physical connection to where you are. And, because you're literally creating your body out of what the land is giving you close by. And I've always felt that the body is has so much information and so much memory in it, so that when you're incorporating those plants that are growing close by into your body, then the more I've done that, the more I've committed to that, the easier it seems to be for me to speak with the land nearby. It's because I'm physically more alike to the land than I would be otherwise, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Yeah. So do you think then that, to go back to Pliny's account briefly, do you think that they were literally using a golden sickle? Does that seem plausible to you? Or do you think it's a metaphorical description or a misunderstanding?
I could see it being possible, because it's not like mistletoe is very hard to cut. It's not a very, it's not a tough plant, like you would never use that to whittle wood or, something like that.
Right.
You'd just be ruining the gold,
Yeah.
but maybe, and again, if it was used only very rarely, and only for that particular purpose, I could see it being a possibility. But, for practical use, yeah, you're definitely right. You would never create a golden sickle. That would be, A, it would be incredibly expensive. And B, it could just be a metaphor for, the connection of the sun and moon. Because most likely I would think that if Pliny maybe he witnessed the ceremony, or maybe he was just told of the ceremony and wrote it down, which I think is more plausible, that he just heard about it.
Yeah.
And, like any indigenous society, you're not going to tell some, total stranger who's not from your particular tribe or your particular people the ins and outs of the ceremony and what it means. They may have just sort of said, well, we cut it with this. Because, and then, he's got to kind of work out what that's supposed to mean. Yeah. But I agree. I doubt that there was, it just doesn't make sense that you would create something like that. It would be, just a huge waste of gold in some way, or maybe, I don't know. Maybe there was some sort of use for it that was beyond that as a magical implement too. Who knows?
Well, I think that it's sound to at least suggest that, the non-iron principle is at work here, right? Like, because that's such a, as we've talked about, that's such a perennial understanding that occurs in different cultures, especially in European traditions, of course, but I've heard things like that outside the European tradition as well. And in fact, if we're taking this kind of stream of transmission of ceremonial magic at face value coming out of the Greco-Egyptian milieu and then into Europe, which I think has been pretty well demonstrated, like by Stephen Skinner and some other scholars who've looked at that line of transmission closely, then it's found in Egypt as well, the same principle. So I think that's a good sort of working tool to have in our kit, thinking about, ceremonially approaching the harvesting of sacred plants for ritual usage, etc., and possibly for healing, that there's good precedent to not use iron-based implements.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. The other thing too that I think is, when we were talking earlier, when you were talking about listening and how important that is, it really reminds me of, I think that's kind of where you start. And if we want to, circle it back to animistic tradition, that listening is so important. There's another plant that I really, really have always felt, I've never used it. I've heard that it has some pretty powerful properties, but it's always really fascinated me. And it's gosh, I can only remember the common name, Elk Weed, and it's gentian, green gentian,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it's this beautiful. And some of them are really long lived from what I've read. But initially, it just appears as this like kind of circular presentation of really thick green leaves, and it'll stay that way for years. It'll just come up that way. It's a perennial, and it'll come up that way every year. But in its last year of life, it'll send up this stalk that has all these beautiful like white flowers on it. And I have always felt drawn to the plant, even though I've never used it. And occasionally they'll flower all together, because they sort of because the seeds are obviously contained in the flowers once the flowers fade and they're pollinated. And so they tend to have these times where they're all flower at once, and you'll go up in the mountains, or or even into, there's some in Garden of the Gods, and there's something about just sitting down with a plant and just being with it for a while, and not harvesting it anyway, just kind of sitting where it's at and seeing the environment that it's in, and looking around and listening to what it's seeing and hearing on a day-to-day basis. That, I don't know, those have been some of the more magical moments that I've had as a Druid, is just sitting down with a plant for a few hours and not talking, not doing anything, leaving a small offering, and just being in the place that it's at and trying to experience the environment that it's in a similar way as I possibly can.
Yeah. Well, I think that touches too on this notion that's really important in any animistic expression, and perhaps particularly in our context as folks who are reclaiming our own native traditions that have been problematized and dimensions of which have been lost, at least in terms of our rational perception. And that is that we can always develop relationships with these spirits and dream with them and speak to them if we know the art of how to do that. And if we can get beyond all of the silly conditionings that we receive in this backward society, and enter that space of deep relationality and deep listening and deep communication, then we can be taught by them the ways in which they want to work with us. And that's kind of ultimately, I think the same goes with the gods, the same goes with all these powers, the ancestors that we're trying to reconnect with in a meaningful way and reestablish relationships with, that they can teach us things. And of course, there's a balance to be found with historical transmission and scholarship and all those things. We don't want to be in a kind of utterly relativistic space where we're off in some corner just channeling what God knows what, and saying, "Oh, this is the tradition." I'm by no means suggesting that, and that's a confusion about oral traditions. I think that a lot of folks who are deeply conditioned in text-based societies like ours have, that oral tradition means chaos, like anything goes, and everyone's just saying it's this, it's that, which is obviously completely false. But I think that this principle here is really important, that the knowledge is never lost so long as those souls exist, right? And we can connect with them and learn from them. And that should be, I think, one of our primary aims in Druidry is really connecting with not just our gods and ancestors, but also with the spirits of plants and animals, non-human embodied creatures that are in the landscape that we're in, wherever we are, and to learn from them what's right and proper and good and life-giving and healing, rather than assuming that we know and drawing from purely from some text or another, but actually to learn in a living way means that we're, as you were saying earlier about incorporating things into the tradition as we reconstruct it and bring it back to manifest life. That means we have a living tradition, not a static dead one, that we can keep learning, keep growing, because that's what nature does. That's what life does, right? I mean, if we're doing anything other than that, then we're basically standing in resistance to the flow of life, which is, as Druids, is definitely not the place we want to be in, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that, you know, and it is that connection that is kind of at the base of probably everything we'll ever talk about in the podcast, because that's the whole point, you know, is to connect, and that the skill of creating that relationship and sustaining that relationship is the basis of just about everything else you do in Druidry, as far as I'm concerned. And like we said, like when you say like oral tradition, like, you know, that idea that oral tradition is chaos, it can't be that way, because in an oral tradition, you're learning things by memory, and you're only going to memorize things that are useful. Right. If they don't work, they don't get passed on.
That's right. Yeah.
You know, so it's a practical tradition in the sense that you're not going to remember something that if you try it and it just simply isn't working, it's not practical. It's not going to achieve the desired end that you're trying to you know, to get to. And that applies with that relationship with plants, and is animistic in that sense that you're looking at that relationship and you're seeing what works and you're passing on what works. And that relationship, not only do you develop a relationship with a plant over your own lifetime, but when you pass that information on to somebody else, the essence of that relationship, the spirit of that relationship, is now getting handed to somebody else. And they're going to take it on, and they're going to reform it, and they're going to, you know, that alchemy is going to continue. And that's beautiful. That's what we miss. That's one of the things that we lack the most in a modern context. And, you know, when you look at, I was watching this excellent series on PBS about Native America. And if you get a chance, watch it, because it is probably one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. It's a few series long, but they were talking about the creation of the Iroquois Confederacy and the weaving of wampum belts, and how they're made from these particular shells that they gather in this very particular way at this very particular spot, because they're the only shells that have the colors that they need. And when you see someone go through the entire process of that, and then when they weave the belt, the story that the belt tells, and the connection that the belt has to the shells that they gather and the place that they gather it at, that's what richness is. That's wealth. That's real wealth. What we have right now is this totally bizarre notion of what wealth is. We have just a totally bizarre notion of wealth. For us, it's accumulation. Accumulate the right things, the right quality of things, and that will make you a wealthy person. But to, we're all descendants of an indigenous culture, no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, no matter where you were born. And when we learn to listen, like you said, to plants and to what they're willing to teach us, and we don't just see them as these sort of mindless, consciousnessless things that are only there for our use and our benefit, then it's a total transformation of your perception of everything, and your perception of yourself, and your perception of the world in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So if you were to give advice to someone on what are the best ways to listen, what would you say would be a good starting point?
One really good starting point is get out of the head, because we're so used to thinking that we listen from the head, like we cogitate from the head, right? And I don't mean head in the as it were in the Druidical sense. I mean head in the popular colloquial sense, right? Like, so we want to get into the head in the Druidic sense eventually.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just speaking in terms of the kind of popular American sense of being in the head, being caught in our rationalistic ideations. I think it's really important to move out of that. And you know, the cauldrons are a really good way to do that, like getting people to translate the primary locus of awareness out of the thought-based mental framework, the egoic kind of framework of noise, and into the depths of the body, and this not just the physical body, but by extension the numinous or spiritual or energetic body or subtle body as well, where the cauldrons reside, you know, and sort of taking the awareness into those centers and practicing perception from those centers rather than from the normal mental space that we inhabit in this cultural mode of conditioning that we're all to one degree or another immersed in. I think that's a really important starting point, because that allows you to, like if you're on the land with a plant or something, it allows you to just get away from the normal analytical processes that would ensue, and instead enter a space where you can just receive. And so following the breath and, you know, perhaps using a sacred word for meditation, those kinds of things can also be really helpful tools in transcending that mental noise and getting to, maybe transcending is the wrong word. Maybe it's descending below that mental noise and getting to the real substructure of being. And that's inherently a place of deep listening, I think. So just those are just some preliminary thoughts. But
no, I think that's absolutely, you know, it reminds me, and I'm sure I'll use this a ton in various episodes, but the Feifiada, you know, that veil, you know, when you translate those words, there's, you know, I like, one of the things I love doing with words like that or phrases like that in Irish is I'll go through the various permutations of what that one word can mean, and then the various permutations of what the other word can mean. And I'll just create a list and I'll join those words together to get as many different combinations between those concepts that the word embodies as I can. And Feifiada is, you know, like companion of silence, steward of silence, keeper of peace. You know, it has all of these associations with quiet and with caretaking that quiet, caretaking that silence. And I find that so fascinating because it's in those moments when, you know, you have stilled your thoughts and you're not racing ahead into the future with a to-do list, or reversing into the past with memories or thoughts. And when you're just there and you're listening and you're taking in and absorbing and committing to that time to be in a relationship with, whether it's a mountain or a hill or a plant or a spring or a river, the connecting need is food. I mean, it's medicine in that classic sense of, you know, the umbilical cord that you're plugging into is feeding all three of those cauldrons, and it's giving you a greater sense of what reality actually is. And that's deeply animistic. You know, there's a unifyingness, I guess, to that, to that idea one of the things I've always loved about animism is that underlying unifying field that we're all connected into, if we can just remember that we're connected to it all the time, instead of dismissing it with the things that we typically dismiss it with, which is, you know, tasks or thoughts or goals, you know, those sorts of things. Not that those things are bad, but you understand what I mean.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
That reminded me just now of a poetic phrase from Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi about meeting me out in the field beyond wrong and right doing. And it's like, that's the field we want to enter. That's where we want to go. It's that space beyond the binary constructs that we are conditioned to constantly create and orient ourselves to. And that's the field of capital B being, perhaps, that we want to go to, and that animism and Druidry as an animistic tradition can certainly take us into if we follow it in earnest and know how to listen properly and all those things. So I think that's indeed the field that we want to be walking into.